Oh. Good evening, I'm Max Holland, American French director of the Met, and it seems we are starting this at Swiss time, 6 o'clock sharp, and here we are. But I'm delighted that you are here, delighted that you could join us for a very special evening here at the Met. Architecture, for sure, defines this museum. It defines every museum. It defines the way how we see art in our spaces, how we encounter art, and also how this is a communal experience with art, with space, with a community that's around us. Architecture plays such a crucial role in regard to what a museum is and also how a museum can further develop. The Met, in that sense, is one building, but it's a building that has developed over more than 100 years. So if you look back at the Met's development from the 1880s, when we were first in the Central Park location, you see the transformations that this building already went through. You have the Woe and Mold original Victorian Gothic building, then the Richard Morris Hunt and McKim Mead and White Beaux-Arts classicism that basically came to the forefront. And on the other hand, also the, I would say, sleek modernism and the simplicity of Kevin Roche and John Dinkeloo and Associates with the modern glass wings that got added to this institution. So at the Met, we probably often speak about the building as probably the biggest object that we have to take care of. An object that, on the other hand, keeps constantly changing and is constantly evolving. And in that context, I have to say that over the next 10 years, we will basically change about a quarter of our galleries within the museum. They will be renewed, refreshed, recontextualized. They will present art, or in a better way, they will tell new stories, new narratives. They will also create new spatial surroundings for our visitors and for our experience with art. And for that purpose, we have engaged three of who we consider the most interesting, most promising, most forward-looking architects of our time. And that's Frida Escobedo, Nada Tarani, and Kulapan Tjantrasast. And we wanted to make a program where each of them can share their ideas about the Met, their current project, and also where they've been in their career, the trajectory that led them to here. So that's the lecture series that we are starting here tonight, and that's been supported by the Directors Fund, and I want to thank for that support. So tonight you will hear from a great intellectual leader, an important force of architecture, Frida Escobedo. She's originally based in Mexico City, but Frida has recently been chosen as the architect of the Met's new modern wing, the Met's Oscar, Tang and Agnes Hsu-Tang Wing for modern and contemporary art. So this month actually is the month where Frida moved on part of her studio to New York and into the Met, where she will start planning and developing the Met's modern wing together with our teams and in a strong dialogue with the entire community of the Met. So Frida will probably share tonight some insights into her also unique practice of wielding architecture to create powerful spatial but also communal experiences. And when doing that, she shows an enormous dexterity and sensitivity in her, and if you look at her buildings, in her really elegant use of space, of material, and also light. And in all of that, she also considers important socioeconomic and ecological issues about how to get there and how we perceive that and how we come together as a community to address that. And with it, she creates what we feel are enormously sensitive but also charged spaces for the art of the 20th and the 21st century. Frida's studio was founded in 2006, and she quickly gained wide recognition in Mexico with projects that she did, the Hotel Boca Chica, the El Eco Pavilion, especially also one of her first projects, La Tallera, one of the most interesting cultural spaces and museums in Mexico, and then Mar Terena, a residential building complex in Mexico City. 2018, she became the youngest architect to do the Serpentine Pavilion. And she did other gallery spaces, the Galerie Nordenhake in Mexico, and stores in all across the United States. Currently, she's working on a whole number of projects. You might hear more about this. I want to especially mention that the renovation and expansion of the Tijuana airport, certainly one of the most complex projects and one of the most complex sites. The construction here in New York of Ray Harlem, a major high-rise building in Harlem in partnership with the Black Theater, and other major projects that are going on in Europe. So I want to thank Frida very much for being here tonight at her new office space at the Met, and for sharing, of course, her sensitive vision, her also creativity and her commitment to realizing this project. Frida will be then joined at the end of her presentation by David Breslin, and who has recently been appointed the Leonard A. Lauder Curator in charge of the Department of Modern and Contemporary Art, and I couldn't be more pleased that he's joining our team. David comes from the Whitney Museum of American Art, where he has most recently served as the Curator and Director of Curatorial Initiatives and has been the co-curator of this year's Whitney Biennial, and before he has been the Curator and Director of the collection at the Whitney. So in his new role here at the Met, David will be collaborating, of course, especially with Frida, but with everyone, to bring not only the modern contemporary department's vision to life, but really to develop together with us what is one of the most important floricultural buildings that we can think of in this time, what is certainly the most significant expansion of the Met Museum, a building that happens and is located in one of the most neuralgic sites that you can imagine, and it is also the biggest capital project in the history of this institution. So in that context, I really also want to acknowledge the extraordinary generosity that we've received from Oscar and Agnes Tang, who are here with us tonight. It was their remarkable gift at the very beginning of when we said, let's go about this new modern wing in a new way, that basically they supported this and led the way to a next development for this institution. There are other major donors here for this project in the room. I saw John Pritzker here, who is leading also the task force of getting this building done, and other supporters and donors. I want to really thank everyone who's here for their support. We will certainly make sure to speak to many of you about how you can support this great project. But first, we want to make sure that you get excited and experienced in Frida Escobedo's practice and her plans for the Met's new wing. So I will turn it over now to Frida. Thank you so much for coming.
Well, thank you, Max, for the great introduction. I hope this lecture is up to the standards and we can get many donations after this. I'm really excited and humbled to be here in this auditorium tonight, and also very excited to be nesting inside the Met with this new project. And also very happy to be sharing with Nader and Kulapat this lecture series. So perhaps the best way to approach the topic of the lecture series, Designing Tomorrow's Met, is to share some of the concepts that informed our vision for the new Oscar L. Tang and Agnes Hsu-Tang Wing, as well as my conceptual approach to architecture and space in general. And some of the concepts actually come from very humble, small projects that seem to be ephemeral, but that have informed the rest of the projects that we do at the studio. So this presentation will present a snapshot into who I am, into the ideas that drive the studio and drive me personally. Running an architecture practice in Mexico City as a woman, or anywhere for that matter, is not an easy task. And to be considered for such a historic project makes me feel very grateful for all the female-led firms whose foundational work has made it possible for me to be here with you tonight. So my perspective definitely emerges from a specific intersection of gender and geographic origins. I am Latin American, and while a substantial part of my work is now outside of my home country, Mexico continues to inform my practice. Context and place is crucial to the work we do at the office. Mexico City is a modern metropolis with ancient roots, a city characterized by creative tensions and juxtaposed realities, where space is created by adapting to powerful and multifarious conditions. In other words, it's a living and breathing museum, full of layered stories from different time periods woven together. Some of them are very evidently visible, others veiled, but all are deeply felt and inform our understanding of the world as we live it today. So in this context, asking the right questions is more valuable than providing answers. This type of fluidity and interconnectedness possesses an imaginative, productive character that I try to instigate in each one of my projects. For almost 20 years, I've had the privilege of experimenting, designing, and questioning space through my own architectural practice, one which is rooted in ideas and aesthetics and ethics informed by gender, accessibility, and the environment. In this presentation, I will share the core values which constitute my approach to architecture, the first one being language. I like to think of architecture as a language, something that helps me organize, express, and explain the world around me. In A Heap of Language, Robert Smithson seems to suggest that language itself grows via deposition and erosion as it gets inhabited and personalized, transferred and translated over time, just like a geological landform. And while working on a split subject, Smithson's renderings of language as a site of cultural sedimentation came to mind, along with this conception of modernist Park Avenue high-rises as monuments to evolution of reverse. The project consisted of analyzing this building, which is one of many modernist office buildings in downtown Mexico City. It seems to possess nothing in particular, but yet, since I was a child living in the same neighborhood as this building, I always stopped and stared. For me, it evokes the same kind of excitement found in the contemplative nostalgia of ruins. However, this is not a ruin. The moment of surprise as a kid, many years later, became a 10-long-year project called Split Subject. This building is an example of a type of ubiquitous but anonymous modernist buildings, and in it one can see how, in contradictory fashion, it is under the impression of being concealed by the apparent neutrality of its facade that this building allows itself to become an index of its own genesis. It seems to define the notion that Juliana Bruno posits, and I quote, "In some way, modernist architecture does not absorb the passing of time. Pressed between the building's glass shell and the interior, it encloses a record of spontaneous proliferation and accumulation at odds with the facade's projected strictness." The visual unfolding that happens in the surface of this building is similar to the simple beauty of some natural geomorphic materials where the register of time and growth provide the richness of value. These facades manifest as spontaneous accretions, subtractions, and reorganizations of the continuous flow of the temporal rhythms of everyday life. The windows of this building acted as two-way mirrors, making up exterior that reflects and deflects, reminding us that the formation of a collective cultural self involves isolating our conceptions of the other. In order to self-identify, we need to self-differentiate. The facade, arguably, works as a collective mirror stage, a representation of the relationships of individuals to the real conditions of collective existence. It works simultaneously as a face and a mask. The face of modern Mexican character, or what grew in the empty recess left by modernist failure, was legible here. The building had a story to unravel, and therefore the facade was treated as a stanza that had to be deconstructed. Removed from the context of origin, these displaced and stripped down fragments do not aim to restore the authentic story of the building, but to generate a projected narrative. In their masked transparency, the building windows recalled a work by Marcel Brothers, a blocked out Un coup d'idée. And with this simple gesture, Marcel Brothers isolated the graphic aspect of Stéphane Mallarmé's piece, literalizing its visual thesis and illustrating that nothing would have happened except the place. The existing building's facade was broken down into the tiers of context and physically represented each one word for word. Later, this piece was presented at the Architectural Effects exhibition at Guggenheim Bilbao in 2019, and more recently at the exhibition Hoy, Today at Galeria Nordenjaque in Mexico City. Using the written word as an architectural directive is something that I had done in previous projects too. While thinking about the proposal for this pavilion for the courtyard of El Eco Museum, I came across an interview of Mexican writer Brenda Lozano. She said that her work was very similar to that of a bricklayer, putting one word next to the other until you build a text, here illustrated by a fragment of a conversation between artist Héctor Zamora and Estrellita Vibrotsky, curator of Latin American art, Iria Candela, about Zamora's piece, Lattice Detour. Lozano's remark at the time reminded me also of Herrera Goulart and the idea that the concrete poem or ideogram becomes a relational field of functions, and one could try to find maximum expression through a minimum of words. With this in mind, I approached the museum's courtyard space like the spread of a blank page, using only cinder blocks as the structural alphabet, maximum expression through the minimum of words, literal concrete poetry. The courtyard, covered in a uniform pattern, worked like a blank page where different typographical arrangements or uses could be made. The playful interaction with these blocks allowed for two programs to juxtapose, the predetermined and the spontaneous. The pavilion was not just a text, but also a constellation of words full of expressive potential that could be ignited by the visitor. Another part of the proposal that was very important was that it disappeared without leaving trace. People were encouraged to take the blocks with them. You could take one as a souvenir, 10 to perhaps build a bookshelf, or 200 to finish the extension of your house, and so on. In the end, it was a developer, of course, who took them all for an apartment building, which didn't come as a surprise. But I still was happy to see the idea that it went back to the city. I am also interested in the idea of accretion. And I often refer to Roger Calvat's book, The Writing of Stones, where the cutting of particular stones revealed the images that they conceal inside. Calvat was not interested in the nature as such, but in its relationship to imagination. The stones selected and exhibited for their beauty become a conjured creation of humanity and nature, where taste, educated by art, met spontaneous mineralogical formations. The secret power of stones prompts a mystical materialism particularly close to Mexican culture. Their intense materiality was about immateriality. Calvat's highly personal vision of the natural allowed him to imagine a form of interdisciplinary knowledge in which the visible, subterranean relationships had to be unearthed in order to allow the manifestation of a new, more complex imagination of the universe. This piece of petrified wood was given to me, It embodies, I apologize, I have a scramble right here. So duality. Another idea that I'm interested in is the idea of duality, identity and distinction, self and otherness, promise and failure, outwards and inwards, reflection and transparency. Central to this concept, as thin as a glazed facade of split subject and as thick as the multiple stories it reveals, is the allegorical figure of the mask, a magical element making it possible to become other, to simultaneously look through and to look introspectively, to bend the present towards the ancient rites that still agitate below the surface. This subsoil is not the sediment from a dead past, but a vital and active constituent part of our present reality. These three-dimensional stone masks depicting a conventionalized human-like face are abundant in the sculptural style associated with the great Central American city of Teotihuacan. These geometrical render horizontal brow, triangular nose, and oval mouth and eyes depicts an idealized facial type that seems to function as a symbol rather than a portrait. In a similar fashion, facades work as collective mirror stages, a symbol of the relationship of individuals to the real conditions of collective existence. Buildings are invested with a great deal of expectations, especially this one. Like a mask, they're performative objects open to chance, reshaped by the direction and action of their users, their presence, and their movement. At first glance, La Tallera Siqueiros seems to be a tribute to the country's past. On one hand, the raw pyramid pattern concrete block screen facade or celosía that masks its interior could be read as a salute to the distinct language of governmental funded Mexican modernism. On the other, the screen resolved several conditions with a simple gesture. It unified a series of buildings that were constructed at different times, while allowing small glimpses of the interior spaces that suggested the additive nature of the building. It is a material also that is low maintenance and ages nicely, providing a solution for a very restricted budget, and it also allows the exterior and interior to bleed into one another, letting the breeze to flow through and for the sun to be filtered in the nice tropical weather of the city of Cuernavaca, where the project is located. But there is something much more complex beyond the building's contextual veil. La Tallera Siqueiros used to be the live workspace of Mexican muralist and political activist David Alfaro Siqueiros. The biggest gesture in the competition proposal was the decision to reconfigure the two gigantic Siqueiros murals, which were originally displayed and viewed in full only from the building's indoor patio, giving only glimpses of its colorful angular strokes from the street, and to position them to the face outwards towards a neighboring public square. To do so, we took down the perimeter wall, making the private patio public and extending the square's dimensions. The angular direction they now have is a public invitation to access the museum. So rather than giving private outdoor events, the new design allows for a possibility of public outdoor activities and a much wider area for public gatherings. So you can see how the gates open literally for this museum. I am also interested in the idea of matter and meaning. For Material Reservoir, a project presented at the first Chicago Biennial, I proposed a series of spaces to complement the Astor's Gates Stony Island Arts Bank, a platform for site-specific commissions and exhibitions, and a venue for artist and scholar residences. In the area, a number of abandoned and dilapidated buildings were being bulldozed by the city of Chicago to address the problem of violence in the South Side neighborhood. As a consequence, the streets were peppered with vacant lots with heaps of terracotta bricks. An iconic element of Chicago's architectural tradition was disregarded as rubble. The demolition debris was collected by the Astor Gate for many months, and for the project, it was used to create a series of thick-walled courtyards. The bricks are stacked simply so that the walls can be deconstructed and reconstructed in a number of different configurations. Bricks as moving pieces on a game board, as tools for negotiation and consensus. No matter the scale that I work at, most of the projects that I work are designed to anticipate social interaction. This perhaps is most visible in Civic Stage, a piece commissioned for Closer at the 2013 Lisbon Architecture Triennial. The piece is a 15-meter wide circular stage that hosted the triennial public program, which ranged from performative lectures to workshops and city policy gatherings. Conceptually, the design gave literal agency to its participants. The physical weight of the audience raised the voice of the speaker. The piece also served as a stage for Andres Jaque's play, Superpowers of 10, and for that, we proposed a circular curtain that was actually attached to the platform. The idea was also to invert the condition of the stage, so the audience would be able to experience the city in different ways by just reframing it. The implicit claim was that the whole world is a stage, and those on the ground, when working collectively, give voice and visibility to the issues that matter. Civic Stage reveals a clear interest in presenting architecture as a practice from which we can learn not only about our physical context, but also the invisible social environment that surrounds us. Engagement can also be achieved at a personal scale. The main idea behind the Serpentine Pavilion was to surround the visitor with the simplest of means, but in doing so, to channel the attention to a specific set of changes and convergences in our ambient world for them to log and to track. The reason behind this strategy is simple. When I was asked to make a proposal for the pavilion, I ran out of ideas. Every time I came up with what I thought was an excellent idea, my team would remind me that that had been done and that had been already created by amazing architects. So reading through the brief again, trying to find a solution, I found that each year the pavilion is acquired and by an individual or an institution after its life in the Kensington Gardens. This meant that the pavilion was actually contesting one of the things that we as architects assume and are taught from day one in architecture school. Architecture ideally is supposed to be permanent and site-specific. So how to design something that would be site-specific but temporary and permanent but in an unknown location? Through history, humankind has leashed the notion of space with all sorts of abstract tools, from the Jeffersonian grid that defines topography to political borders oblivious of social exchange and interaction, to the parallels and meridians. And it is precisely through these abstract measures of space and time that most human interactions occur. It turns out that ground zero for the meridians is just a few miles away from the Kensington Gardens, and the Greenwich Meridian line is traced right here. This became the way in which we could propose a pavilion that could be site-specific even when it was moved to a different location, no matter what it was, because it would always echo its original site. The essence of this process was simply to place the experience of time at the heart of the physical structure by performing a pair of simple moves in space in order to generate a dynamism of time. The first was to establish a firm regulatory line or datum that snaps to grid with the Earth's rotational axis to provide a literal global orientation. This mark is announced explicitly as an alignment to the Greenwich Meridian line. The second was to rotate the axis of the pavilion to align with a local integer of reference that is known as the Serpentine Gallery. So the angle formed is recorded at this intersection of a standing pool that comes together through a structural ground plane and the edge of the roof canopy above it. This gesture marks both the divergence of orientations as well as their convergence, as if to weave the local context of Kensington Gardens to a larger constellation in a simple intersection of lines. In words of Sanford Quinter, the central goal of the Serpentine Pavilion was to lay down a cosmic and earthly scaffold against which to render sensible the ceaseless unfolding rational universe in which we blindly, but perhaps at moments still ecstatically, make our home. Conceiving the meridian line as inseparable for the pavilion, the building position was not only at the scale of the canonical expression of the building, but something with multiscalar and cultural material implications. In one of the chapters of the pavilion's catalog, Marina Otero-Garcia explained how the global measure of space and time at the Greenwich Meridian line deploys has produced political and economical effects over hundreds of years. The prime meridian was central to the international division of labor and systems of spatial distribution and production, accumulation and exploitation connected to the history of imperialism and colonialism. The existence of a longitude zero is evidence of how power is produced and materialized in physical and virtual structures, technologies, and aesthetic regimes. It renders the other territories beyond Greenwich as peripheral and in perpetual delay and latency. Aware of the afterlives of the Serpentine Pavilions, in autumn the structures are dismantled, transported, and relocated. So I am to design an architecture that was to be situated, yet places, a way for me to tie it to the site and free from its site. So here, notions of locality, durability, and spatial presence required different meanings and challenged the traditional relationships between architecture and the land it occupies. These are some of the images that were taken also by some photographers, and it does turn into a weaving of time and light. So, as a conclusion, and going to the next chapter of the Met, for me, fluidity possesses an imaginative, productive character. My projects are not designed to organize, but almost to instigate this character. My architecture is not one of control. It proceeds from an excavation into the historical, social, and geological layers of the site, whose stratification is exposed and provoked, challenging the power relationships between people, space, and matter. And this involves necessarily a reflection on time, an interpretation of existing traces, and a concern for the new ones that the project will leave. Architecture bears the marks of duration, life, and weathering. It reveals the underlying stratum in the social psyche. American writer and cultural critic James Panero described the Metropolitan Museum of Art as a museum of the metropolis, a city within the city, a cosmos for the cosmopolitan, expansive and uncontainable, a home for the culture owned by no one person and belonging to it all. So for this proposal, We want to highlight and give new life to the 20th, 21st century collections for the Met, and to carve out more opportunities, to put them in conversation with other areas of the museum. That is, to weave them together within the larger tapestry that the museum is. We believe that weaving connections can allow us to recognize and celebrate the common threads that run across different times, geographies, and ideologies. And in doing so, we may find new spaces for self-reflection and connection with others. Our proposal for the new Tang Wing is designed to build upon the material history of the museum. However, our approach is not a nostalgic continuation of the past, but the search for layers of information that can give new reading to the present and, as a result, the future. The Met, as one of the most relevant sites of cultural and global, for culture on a global scale, contains inherent pluralities that could and should be manifested in physical space. This idea recalls what Martinican writer Edouard Glissant names mondialité, a term that promotes a global dialogue without erasing the idiosyncrasy of particular localities. It is essential for us that the Tang Wing can speak of its own history and the context that it surrounds, the museum, the park, and the city. It is also crucial that it expresses the ever-expanding relationships that it contains within. We want to think of a building that becomes an edifice made of time, what was, what will be, what is. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frida, and thanks everyone for joining. My name is David Breslin. I'm not yet an official employee of the Met, so this is a great way to start things off. And Frida, I almost feel like we can cut to, in some ways, something about you, because you so beautifully framed a lot of your theoretical thinking, that I thought that we could, in some ways, talk about the future by maybe talking a little bit of your past, some of your loves and commitments and where you come from. I was preparing for this conversation and I came across a beautiful quote that you made in an interview from 2018. You're talking about visiting your father, who's a doctor, at the hospital and staring out the window. And you said, I was trying to understand how space reflects people's personalities. Those guys are fighting. This couple is happy. All that is revealed by design. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and also talk a little bit about, in these first days here at the Met, what looking into this window looks like, what the conversations have been, because it's very much the beginning part of your process.
Yeah, it's a great way to put it, like understanding a space by noticing how it materializes or crystallizes specific behaviors. And that was a curiosity of mine when I was a child, because I was very bored, apparently, and I was just like looking at this window. And I think that kind of stuck with me because I still live in an apartment building and I refuse to put curtains on just because I love so much looking at the city. My partner hates me for that.
A very New York thing, too.
Yes. But I do feel that the moment of realization was thinking that that building that I saw from the street, from below to above, without being able to see into the units, was a completely different thing than seeing it from above and being able to see the lives that were happening. And it was not just like a voyeuristic kind of thing to do, but it was like the forms of expression, like how people adapt their spaces, how they inhabit them, and how they complete them. And many years later, I realized that architecture is never finished, actually. Like it's a process of evolution, of accretion, of editing, of it's almost like the ruining rivers that I was mentioning.
It's interesting that you bring up the Roger Caillois discussion of the stone. And what's for me so interesting about him is that he was writing about stones, he was writing about play, he was talking about games, he was thinking about the sacred. And it really seems like your work is trying to delve into these different openings so that people can feel these different aspects or emotions. And I wonder if you can talk about, I mean, there's something very serious about architecture, but there's also something about joy and possibility in your work. And I wonder if you could talk about those things that maybe aren't spoken about as much in architecture and where they figure in your work.
I think the first time that I realized that, or were able to experiment with that, was with the Leco Pavilion, and that's why I always present it in my lectures. I think it's a very small project, but it's the one that really showed how these interactions really happen in space and how people inscribe their emotions and their intentions and their ambitions and their apprehensions into space. No, it is physically materialized. So I think that's something that we should question, because when we have a specific client, it's easy to have that interaction. But when clients become more complex, when we have lots of people living and giving an opinion on a specific space, is more complex. But then it becomes extremely complex when we're designing for someone that we don't know, no? And that is the case of all public projects. You can get a sense of how people may interact. You may do interviews, you may have participatory design, you can deploy many strategies, but at the end of the day, there are these moments of resonance that are quite magical. There's no way of explaining that. Like when someone is sitting on the same spot that you thought you would be sitting, and enjoying this space and the sun coming in or the breeze flowing through, those are moments of connection that to me are the most special.
I wonder if you could also talk about some of the spaces that to you have been the most special. I mean, in addition to staring out the window of a hospital, there are obviously buildings that you love and made you want to pursue this as a life. And I wonder if you could mention some of those, talk about what they bring, or maybe some of those that you're working with when you're thinking about what the Tang Wing could be.
I mean, I grew up in Mexico City, and I was living in Condesa. And to me, I was living 1 block away from Parque Mexico. And it's a park that has a little lake with docks. It's kind of like this fantasy land. And that park and that moment were really special to me. Like, it was a world within a world. That's a moment that I remember fondly, because it was like this like onion, of experiences that could happen in a very loud city. But then it became like this sanctuary for me and the family. That's another one. And of course, like the waiting room of a hospital, apparently. But then later on, maybe it was not about like the architecture designed by architects, because we could go through many examples of that. But it was more about understanding how people also build their own environments. So starting in Universidad Iberoamericana, I had to cross the city, and in one of the neighborhoods that I had to cross, there was a lot of self-construction. And this is part of like the information that I received also for thinking about the cinder block as an infinite form of expression, which has a lot to do with the idea of weaving. People were doing with a simple modular material an infinite amount of expressions that would accommodate for their space and their ambition. So I think that was also very imprinted.
Your presentation so beautifully weaved through some of the artworks that are in your brain all the time. And when you had the Solowit print up, it reminded me of an experience I had when I was in graduate school. I was taking my final exams, my qualifying exams, and someone asked me not what the Solowit was about, not where it came from conceptually, but what color was put down first. There was this very technical way of thinking that these details matter, that the building blocks matter. And in some ways, it seems like you're thinking very deeply about the Met's collection and different touch points. And I know that you've spoken about Ani Alvarez a bit. I wonder if you could talk about that work, maybe weaving and tapestry more broadly, and how that ties into your conception around architecture.
Well, I think it's just like one of these personal fascinations that one has, but then you turn it into an excuse to work on that theme. I think I'm interested in that craft because it's a very feminine craft. It's traditionally something that women do. There's a mathematical precision to it. You can see like the embroidered shirts of women in Oaxaca, and the ability to manage dimensions and rhythm just like very intuitively, because they're not counting threads. They're just doing patterns by memory, but at the same time telling stories of their families in those weavings. No? So it's symbolism imprinted into that, but there's like the mathematical precision. I think it's very similar to architecture. The idea also that the material behaves in a different way, like how the fabric falls, how it lets the body breathe or not, or how it can constrain it. I think there are a lot of relationships about that. But also the idea that because it was a feminine tradition, it has not really been considered as one of the finest arts, which I think it is. So I'm always thinking about all of these beautiful examples that really inform the way that we behave, the way that we construct relationships, the way that it informs other disciplines. I think the perfect example was the Annie Alvarez tapestry that was in Camino Real, which became a research project of mine. The tapestry that was hanging in the Camino Real vestibule and the lobby, it's a bar. And it was taken down for a renovation of the space, and it disappeared for many years. And many years after, they found that it was actually in one of the warehouses of the same hotel. So this tells you a lot about like how the value of these textiles was diluted, and now it's one of the most important pieces of Annie Alvarez. But
well, I was thinking when you were talking about Edouard Glissant, is also how he really spoke about kind of the privileging of the individual object or specific culture, kind of the world within a world that you spoke about a little bit in terms of the park in Mexico City. And I wonder, one of his famous lines is the right to opacity, the right to have something that isn't always legible or transparent, which is kind of a complicated thing when you try to translate that to a museum like the Met that is very much about pedagogy, teaching, accessibility, visibility. But we know that artworks are mysterious, that they do strange things, that need their own time to do it. So how do you think about that when you're building spaces? It doesn't have to be for an artwork, it could be for people who need their own conditions. How do you balance this idea of accessibility and legibility and maybe withholding, so there are spaces of contemplation or quiet or remove?
Yeah, and actually that also happens with architecture lectures. Like sometimes people want to hear more stories than they are. Like, well, it's just, like this room, or it just felt good. I have no further explanation for that. The right for opacity, I'm going to use. No, but I feel like this is why the relationship to the Galois idea of how we read things is important, because of course there's a consensus on how we should read specific pieces or the stories behind them, and that's very valuable information. But there's also something that is projected into the object, that's why I'm also fascinated by the idea of like this see-through mirror film, like this idea that something can be transparent enough for you to access it, but you're definitely reflected into that object. Otherwise, it doesn't tell you anything. So you could learn a lot about it, but it doesn't mean anything to you. So I think that's what we should be playing with.
It's a beautiful call for specificity, but openness to each of us who comes with all of our own stuff to a place or to an artwork. I wonder if you could talk a little bit, Frida, about coming here. As you said, you're nested here. You told me today that you finally got a mattress, so you're officially a New Yorker in your apartment. And the project is very much in the beginning. I know that you're talking to colleagues across the museum about what this wing can be. What questions will you be asking people? What are the things that you need to know or need to ask that people might not know yet without your questions, to be able to, for this to be the project that you want it to be?
It has been a very interesting month, coming here. I've had the opportunity to have interviews with many of the key people in the museum, and that has been just like a wonderful experience. If someone would have told me, like, you would be working on this museum and you would be getting to know all of these people, I wouldn't have believed it. And that was one of the reasons that we decided to stay the first months in the museum. And so the location where I'm at is right above the main hall. It's a very special space because there's a tiny door and someone from the construction department let me in, and there's a murmur of the Great Hall coming through. So it's like these brown noise, but it's very special because you can really hear as people come in and out of the museum, and then it becomes really quiet in the evening. So that kind of idea of how people flow within the space is something that maybe becomes a question, because of course there's a lot of information. I need to learn a lot about the collection, how it is related to other collections, what's the vision for the future for not just that wing, but the rest of the museum, what's the master plan for this institution, but also how people are reacting to all of those small changes, how they shift their navigation, how they change their eye, what are these new publics, how do they engage with different eras and geographies. So I think it's more about the behavior of the people.
And what about doing this project now? You have the ecosystem of the Met, which is very specific. You go out the door, you're in the city, you look out the windows, you're in the park. And there's this very specific and a beautiful tension between those two sensibilities. And I just, for you who have worked in Europe before and have tons of friends here, what does it mean to work here at this project right now?
Well, I'm always thinking about the duplicity, and the idea of the duality. When I go out of the museum, it's either you go to Fifth Avenue or you go to the park, and it's two different cities, like going into nature or going into the depth of the city. But I don't know, I think I feel very privileged to also have this amazing group of friends that some of them are here, and to continue those connections, because it's actually a constellation of people. We're all here because we're connected to someone else, and the expectation is to have that constellation grow. So,
I think a constellation of people making up this building and the Tang Wing is a great place to end. So I just want to thank Frida for her generosity, for all the work ahead, for everyone here, for coming out this evening, and look forward to seeing you for the next couple of talks in the series to come. Thank you.
Thank you.